This class, definitely the power level goes up the closer you are, and it's very timing oriented. This class actually has some of the highest damaging spells in the mod, but a lot of people don't really connect with that fact very directly, because actually getting all of your spells to cooperate in the way that you would like is not necessarily the easiest thing. Now that number is more limited. You can't have infinite Cragbolt mines. You can make a good amount of them. I believe the limit is 5. You saw how that on that last cast, the bubbles were more bunched together on the enemy, and so he ran into all of them. That pretty much sums up what we wanted with this class. It's more tactical, right? You kind of want the enemies to come to you. You don't necessarily just blast them from far away. You have to set up traps. You can just lay these out there. And because they have this build-up before they shoot, it gives them a precast mechanic. What's up, guys? How's it going? Today we're going to be doing a class breakdown. It's part of the series that I'm working on YouTube, where I'm making a bunch of different videos describing each of the classes and doing like a general breakdown of all of them. And then I'm also pairing that with some playthrough videos and sort of like talking through the various like strategies and play styles that the classes come with. So this one's for Underworld Mage. This class is interesting. It's very interesting because it's one of the ones that's purely original. We've basically made it up. Now, up to a certain point. We were inspired by the idea of the Dragonkin soldiers that use frozen lightning. I wanted to expand the frozen lightning into a whole archetype, right? A whole class with lore and backstory and everything about it. You know, there's portions of it that are still a work in progress, but we have made a full suite of spells already for the class, right? And it's now a playable class and so on. This is really interesting for me personally, because one thing that's always difficult in Souls games is fitting in lightning damage on sorcery, like a sorcery that deals with lightning damage, right, that uses it exclusively. And so that's what this class is. So that's one reason why we converted Frozen Lightning from being an incantation in base game to being a sorcery, is that we needed a sorcery that deals lightning damage. This class uses lightning damage, and it scales entirely with intelligence. It does not use arcane or faith. It's just intelligence, and it's just lightning damage. I would sort of categorize the class as a hybrid in terms of the spellcasting style between utility and DPS, or just like damage. It's not trying to be incredibly offensive, but it's also not trying to be incredibly defensive either, right? It's more like a split between the two. The way that this class works is it's centered around dealing damage at short to mid-range. It's not focused on doing damage at extremely far range. It does have some further range options, but they're more limited in terms of like what they're capable of, like in terms of like how reliable they become at long range, or like how much damage you can produce at long range, unlike say Glint Sorcerer, which is really just no frills, all damage, and very good range and so forth, right? The other thing is that this class, because it's frozen lightning, deals frostbite buildup, right? So it causes frostbite on enemies along with its normal damage. And so frostbite, just like in base game, when it procs, it will take down some of their HP by percentage, and then for a duration afterwards, they will take more damage from attacks. So that kind of inherently, like that mechanic built in, kind of inherently gives them a little bit of a leg up against enemies that can be frostbitten. The concept behind the spellcasting type in general is that it's tactical. It's not meant to just shoot things and nuke them from really far away. It's more sort of meant to lay traps, be reactive, and sort of outplay the enemies based on more like reactive spells. Almost like the concept of like building turrets. So they have spells that are like landmines, or they have spells that are sort of like phalanx spells where it'll shoot off when they get close. Or they have spells that interact directly with attacks, right? Like by parrying them or what have you. So I really wanted to make this class much more like technically oriented and be like tactical. And just like all the other classes, their play styles, they have the more pure caster type, they have the more hybrid type, and they have the more melee oriented, where they're primarily using weapons. So they kind of, just like all the spellcasting classes, they support all three. Your first three spells that you start with are Frozen Cragbolt, Cragbolt Bubbles, and Frozen Lightning Armament. Frozen Cragbolt, it's repurposed from base game. Do you remember the spell Magic Glint Blade from base game? That's what Frozen Cragbolt is. Magic Glint Blade no longer exists in the Glint school. Basically was taken from there, brought over here, and then given new visuals and repurposed entirely. But the concept is the same. You cast it, it builds in the air, then it shoots a projectile forward. And the range of it is not huge. It's actually shorter than Magic Glint Blade is in vanilla, but the full charge version does go a little further and does a little bit more damage. So if I was to target this guy, if I'm here, I probably won't hit him. Yeah, but I have to get a little closer, and then I can hit him. Like I said, the emphasis of this class is not on doing tremendous damage at long range. It's more focused mid to short range. But that doesn't mean that its spells can't be super powerful. Frozen Cragbolt is, you know, it doesn't do too much damage, but it also builds Frostbite. So spells that build Frostbite or build a status effect, they kind of do need to be tempered a bit in terms of how much damage they deal, because when that Frostbite procs, they can be extremely good. The other thing is that this spell is extremely spammable, right? You can just lay these out there, and because they have this build-up before they shoot, it gives them a precast mechanic, right? Where you can put a whole bunch of damage out there before the enemy is aware of you, and then when they do become aware of you, all that damage is already out there. So the opportunity cost is easier to manage at the beginning of the fight. Extremely good spell. It's not necessarily like class defining, but it's definitely one that could be sort of a mainstay of the class. Okay, Cragbolt Bubbles. This one's pretty interesting. So we've taken the bubble spells, like all the bubble spells from base game, and once again repurposed them into Dragonkin. And the idea here is that these bubbles are now frozen lightning, right? Instead of just some kind of magic damage generated from the Clayman oracles. So we wanted them to have more practical use than they did in the base game, because we felt that these spells in general were a little bit on the weaker side. So they definitely deal more damage than they did in base game. They also do build Frostbite, which is useful. They track a little better, and they go a little further. But they don't necessarily... There's still randomness to it. Like, you saw how that on that last cast, the bubbles were more bunched together on the enemy, and so he ran into all of them. That pretty much sums up what we wanted with this class. It's more tactical, right? You kind of want the enemies to come to you. You don't necessarily just blast them from far away. You have to set up traps. Bubbles are a good way of sort of doing that because they don't travel too fast, right? So you kind of need enemies to walk into the trap. If I'm just trying to DPS something with this spell, it's pretty difficult to kill something that's big. I mean, considering they may not walk into it, they may jump to the side, they may not even get close, just because of the travel speed. But if something does get hit by all the bubbles, then it's extremely devastating. That's the reward. That's sort of the trade-off, right? If they do happen to get hit by every projectile, it's extremely good. And so bigger enemies, for example, just have a lot of trouble with spells like Bubbles. Bubbles is incredibly good on large enemies. Casting time's on the slower side. You know, it's not the sort of thing that you necessarily want to cast right off the bat, or that you want to cast when you're in an emergency. However, it does once again lend itself to this pre-casting concept that I was just talking about, where you can pre-cast both of the first two spells that I just told you. So you can put damage in the bank, so to speak. Right? Like, for example, I could do this. I could full charge Bubbles, and then I could cast Cragbolt afterwards and create a situation where all of that stuff could be hitting around the same time if I'm distance right and I'm timing it right. So you can create these massive amounts of burst damage, which this is sort of the central theme of the class, is that you set up these traps, you set up these precast situations, and then you create this really big burst, this powerful burst that all hits them at once, maybe creating staggers, maybe generating frostbite, and just allowing you to do that. Now, it's not always easy once the fight is actually begun. Like, you need to capitalize on windows for this stuff. Opportunities, punishes. You capitalize on punish windows in order to actually accomplish some of these strategies. And that some spells are better than others in certain situations. And this class is really a big example of the benefits of having sort of a wider toolkit rather than having one projectile that you just spam to kill something with. Definitely not what the class is about. Okay, so the next spell is Frozen Lightning Armament. This is just a weapon buff. So it buffs any old weapon in your right hand. Here we go. So Frozen Lightning Armament is just a weapon buff. Just coats the weapon in Frozen Lightning. Gives a slight damage buff and also adds Frostbite to the attacks. That's all it does. So, pretty simple. Any of the spell classes that sort of start with a weapon buff like this, it's in a way sort of the acknowledgement that perhaps their starting toolkit of spells is not necessarily adequate to handle some of their very early game stuff. And so we're sort of saying, if you need to rely on your weapon, this will make it a little better, if that's what you need to do. But it's not necessarily required, right? Like, it's definitely something that you could just go straight at spells, especially with this class, because you're given 2 offensive spells right out of the gate. Okay, next up is Cragbolt Wisp. This is basically like Glintblade Phalanx, or something similar to that. Except instead of having a whole bunch of projectiles that come out in an arc, it's simply one. It's one big frozen bubble. And so when you get close, it shoots off and does very good damage. It also has like a decent sized AoE when it impacts, so making it pretty different than a lot of the glint type of spells. In terms of range, once again, it's centered around that sort of short to mid range, but also on that trap setting philosophy, right, where you're creating these burst damage effects. So it's another thing that you could layer with those opening 2 spells to create that nice burst. It is a little bit loud visually, like it kind of gets in the way, and that is something that will come up again when we're talking about these spells. I wanted to say it here, and I probably will say it again before we're done with the class breakdown, is that these visual effects were sort of us making the visual theme the sort of first iteration, right? Meaning we got the idea out there. It's a bubble, there's lightning, and there's frosty stuff. So frozen lightning bubbles, right? And a lot of them are too visually loud right now. They will not stay this way. These are sort of like the first version. So eventually, all of these visual effects that kind of get in the way of the screen or a little bit too visually noisy will get tamped down and made more reasonable. But for the time being, it was just a situation where we got them in the game, and they look right, they look good, they match the theme, and now it's just a matter of sort of not like reining them back a little bit visually. But this spell, once again, very useful and very on theme for what the class is trying to do. Okay, so now we get to our first defensive spell. This is a buff called Armor of Bubbles. So Armor of Bubbles puts a bunch of bubbles on your body. They're all frozen lightning bubbles. So the way it works is, it's a defensive enchantment. Cover your body in bubbles containing frozen lightning. Grants additional stamina regeneration, increases physical absorption by 20%, and reduces equip load by 20%. This effect ends after 1 minute, or after being hit by 3 or more. After being hit 3 or more times. This is an interesting one because we were toying around with for the first time with buffs that last for a decent duration, or until being hit enough times in combat. Right, so it has this like nice passive effect that's happening, and part of that is also damage reduction, but it's only going to reduce damage from 3 hits, and then it's gone. If I go and get hit 3 times, 1, 2, oh, so it went after 2 just because of duration, but let's do it again. So 1, 2, 3, and then it expires. So now the benefit is gone. And this was something that does make sense thematically for bubbles, right? I guess the idea being that they get popped if they get hit. So that's a fun one. Just a good defensive buff. And it also, it's something that I might tweak in the future in terms of duration to make it last more than 1 minute, because it does have that cancellation clause of being hit. So it kind of makes sense that it might last a little longer than your typical buff, considering that it can go away much quicker than other buffs if things go wrong. All right, next is the next bubble spell, which is the Great Bubble spell, which is just one big singular big bubble. Cast time a little bit slower, which is once again aligned with the way that the class works. However, the damage of all the Great Bubble spells is pretty huge. It's once again been repurposed from being Clayman sorcery to being a Dragonkin sorcery, so it's frozen lightning. But it has been massively improved from base game. It travels further, it tracks better, and it does more damage, and it builds frostbite. So the spell is just a huge improvement on the base game version. And the full charge one does very, very good damage as well. Also knocks enemies back. It's just good, but is a little bit on the slower side. So once again, trying to leverage this whole burst damage idea, right? You could use a lot of little bubbles for a wider target, or you could use the one great big bubble for a single target, especially in more ambush type situations, right? Which is what the class is trying to create, is ambushes. So once again, maintaining the theme, maintaining the concept. Now we start getting into the spells that sort of make the biggest splash with me and also with the players. Cragbolt Mine, in my opinion, is practically speaking one of the best spells of the class. It puts a mine on the ground, like right at your feet. That mine lasts for quite a while. And when an enemy walks into it, it explodes and deals damage and builds frostbite. Cragbolt Mine in previous patches was way, way stronger because you could have an unlimited number of them on the screen at once. Now that number is more limited. You can't have infinite Cragbolt Mines. You can make a good amount of them. I believe the limit is 5. You needed this to be a little more balanced than it was. And one of the reasons why it was so imbalanced was that you could stack 100 of them and then have an enemy walk onto it and one-shot any boss if the boss wasn't initially aggroed. The change obviously had a balance issue, right? Where if you're stacking them up, then you can kill anything. But for me, the most important reason to make this change was actually to maintain game integrity. If you stack 100 of this type of effect, then it causes huge performance issues, right? Like just rendering it is a huge problem, and that it slows the game down, makes it run bad. So it was a twofold bug fix in that sense. Like it was a balance fix, but it was also a legit bug fix. So also, we changed the damage level on Cragbolt Mines, so they don't necessarily juggle enemies. In particular with minefield. With Cragbolt Mine, you can see it still does. It still juggles. So for single target, Cragbolt Mine is still probably the choice. But we'll get to minefield in a little bit. Okay, next. This spell is one of the spells that I personally am most proud of in terms of development. Because as far as I know, this is the only spell that has ever been made in any Souls mod that can actually parry attacks. It acts as a parry. It parries anything. It'll parry a spell and do essentially like a Carian retaliation, except instead of making glint blades, it makes bubbles that then shoot back. But it can also parry melee attacks. Essentially what this spell says is that if you're a parry hybrid style, meaning you're using like a weapon to do ripostes with, then you don't actually need a shield, right? You can just have this spell, and then your staff is the shield if your goal is to parry and not necessarily block, which I play that way all the time, where I'm not blocking, I'm just parrying. And this spell is so cool for that. I love that about it. Okay, next, Cragbolt Upwelling. This spell, it kind of splits audiences, I would say, because once again, it's very visually loud, and that is something that I might end up reducing just for performance, because once again, that is a lot of, we call them bullets when it's something out there on the ground or a projectile, a visual effect that causes damage, basically, that comes from a spell. It's a lot of bullets on the ground, and it might need to be dialed back a bit. However, the concept behind the spell is one that I very much want to retain. It is not a mine, right? Meaning when they step on it, it doesn't explode. It explodes after a timer. It is a time bomb. It does extremely good damage against large targets, right? Because they're going to get hit by more of this area effect. The other thing it does is that while the mines are out there, or while the upwelling is gathering, so to speak, it actually builds frostbite on things that are in the area of it before the damage goes off. So it's also a way to sort of prep or prime your enemies to be frostbitten, because it builds up some frostbite on them before it goes off. So it's not useless even if it doesn't connect in the most direct way. The reason why this spell is important is it, first of all, once again, lends itself to this pre-casting concept. I'm bringing people into my trap, right? And it's a big trap, this one. But it's not a reactive trap. It's a trap that needs a certain timing. So if you were to combine all of these things into one sudden burst, then you're looking at potential for massive damage. Massive burst damage, anyway. Underworld Bubble Shield. So once again, just like Armor of Bubbles, it's a little visually loud, and this one is probably the worst offender for visual loudness. It obscures the game to such a tremendous degree, and it's not just the size that's doing that, it's also the brightness. It's so forward, it lures your eye to it, even when you're trying to look past it. So we're absolutely aware that this is not visually the way we want the spell to work. Functionally, though, the spell works very well. So functionally, here's what it does. Cover your body with a single large bubble containing frozen lightning. Increases all absorption by 75%, and increases all damage, all lightning damage you deal by 5%. The effect ends after 1 minute, or after being hit 1 or more times. Also, when it bursts, it deals damage to everything around it, wherever it bursts. Functionally, I'd say the spell works great. It works like the physic, almost, right? It's reducing pretty much all damage, but it breaks after 1 hit. But the upside is that it does a retaliation hit. See, it knocked him away when he hit me. It's definitely spammable if your plan is to just get hit a bunch, right? It's taking away so much damage. There's so much damage mitigation attached to it that you can certainly spam it with pretty good effect. The other thing is, if your plan is to not be hit with it, it's still useful because it increases all lightning damage you deal during its duration. So it's just a great utility spell all around. Basically no reason not to use it except the visual. And so as soon as we fix that, the spell, I think, will probably be way higher tier than it currently is. The thing that prevents it from being high tier right now is that visual. And so yeah, it's definitely something we're aware of. Now, I have in the past used visual obscurement generated from spells as a balancing factor. And the balancing factor associated with visuals was something I used in light sorcery in the Dark Souls 3 mod, where the spells were often very strong, very fast, and sometimes even cheap on mana, but obscured your vision to the point where you sort of questioned if you wanted to use them or not. You had to think about, will I be able to effectively deal with this enemy if I'm flashbanging myself, right? And thematically for that class, it did make sense because it was like light sorcery, right? You're going to flashbang stuff, flashbang yourself. That was not the intention behind this class at all. So the fact that it is visually obscuring is not what we want and will be fixed. I just want to reiterate that sort of as many times as I can. It's a starting point for the class, right? This is more about testing functionality at this early stage of development. So then we get to Frozen Lightning Stake, which is the simply renamed and repurposed Frozen Lightning Spear from base game that was an incantation, right? So this was, of course, the spell that started it all for this class. You plant this down in the ground, and then you get this cone shape of building lightning that then strikes down. Tactically and thematically, it works. It has that precast aspect to it, although a little bit shorter than the rest. Damage on it is quite strong. Frostbite buildup on it's quite strong. And it has an AoE, so it's kind of in fitting with everything the class is trying to do. And also, most importantly, it's not incredibly long range. It's kind of medium range. We have sped up the cast animation, though, so it's actually more practical to use now and not very, very slow and awkward like it used to be. I think damage to mana ratio, this is one of the better spells. The amount of damage you get out of it based on how much FP you spent is very, very good. It's very positive. Great bubble volley. So the idea here is that it's just like the Great Dragonkin bubble, except there's multiple bubbles and they're large. The uncharged version is going to shoot 3 bubbles. They come out at a slightly random angle, but then they home in, but they kind of slow down and don't necessarily reach the thing you're trying to shoot at if your range is too far. So once again, short to mid-range spell like the rest of the arsenal, but they do move slow, so you can see there that they're not that reliable unless you're using them like a shotgun. This class, definitely the power level goes up the closer you are, and it's very timing oriented. You could see that if I started to cast that too late, he would have hit me and interrupted my spell. But if I cast it at just the right time, then I get that really satisfying shotgun effect where I'm doing massive damage because I'm hitting with all the bubbles, right? But once again, this cast animation is much faster than vanilla. If you full charge, now you're looking at something different. You're looking at something completely different. Because this is 5 bubbles. Well, there's only 4 there, but I think it's still 5. Yeah, there's 5 bubbles. And once again, they come out at a random angle. And they have the exact same behavior, but now you're sacrificing more opportunity cost because the cast time is once again slower. They do travel a little further than the 3. And if all 5 bubbles hit something, you're talking, once again, very, very high damage. This class actually has some of the highest damaging spells in the mod, but a lot of people don't really connect with that fact very directly because actually getting all of your spells to cooperate in the way that you would like is not necessarily the easiest thing. And that's the balancing factor, right? They're not always that cooperative. Flying off in random directions at the start, moving slow. What if the enemy jumps to the side and goes around them? What if it goes over their heads? All of these things are possible. But if you do find that moment where you're actually connecting with every bit of your damage potential, you're talking about really, really high damage. Dragonkin Downpour is sort of the first sort of turret style spell introduced to the class, which I find to be can be very fun and tactical. So Dragonkin Downpour is a turret, right? You're going to cast it and it's going to shoot out a bunch of frozen lightning bolts or something in its general direction with kind of a wide cone shape. Damage is not the purpose of this spell. It's not really what it's for. It's not for dealing massive DPS. What ends up happening to players who are, I think, playing the first time or streaming it for the first time or whatever, is that what they do is they get a new spell, they look at it, and then they assess, is this spell good? And so some people will like pick up Dragonkin Downpour and watch it, the damage it deals against a tough enemy, and see that the damage doesn't do that much, and they're underwhelmed by it, and they don't know why it's good or why you would use it. And this is kind of where I want to sort of broaden people's perspective a little bit about spellcasting, is that, first of all, if you're casting... So once again, we're going back to that pre-cast notion of I'm casting a bunch of things before I begin the fight. That this is, once again, a really good precast because it starts putting damage out there that you don't actually have to cast. So in terms of opportunity cost, it's amazing. Anything that is a turret that shoots on its own is insanely powerful in Souls games in general because you don't have to spend time casting when the actual damage is being delivered, right? So turret spells in general need to be not the strongest spell in your arsenal because otherwise they just go insane. They're just so strong. So this spell does not have incredibly amazing homing where every single bullet is going to be hitting the enemy. It's kind of spread out in an area, right? But it is a turret, so it's free damage, essentially. It also is free frostbite buildup. So it's not really about damage. It's about dealing a little bit of damage while you're doing your other damage to help assist you in that burst, and also building frostbite in the process. So once again, it becomes a timing. What is the proper spell ordering? First, a bunch of mines, then throw out some bubbles, and then do a downpour to maybe pull them, and then while they're running towards you, they're running into bubbles and mines and also getting hit by the downpour. That sounds like a complete strategy. Downpour by itself is not a complete strategy, essentially. Okay, up next, one of my favorites, Cragbolt Spear. So you throw it like a lightning spear, it flies forward, and then it explodes. The explosion size is quite large, considering how it works, but the range is much shorter than people might expect. And I think it can be something of an optical illusion in that some people think they're going to hit something, right? Like I throw it back here, and then that happens, and then because the explosion went off, they might think, why didn't that hit him? It looked like it hit him. But it's just because the explosion size is pretty large, right? But they didn't actually get close to the enemy. In order to hit him, I'd have to be relatively close. Once again, a mid-range spell. But the damage is so strong. The damage is just so good on this thing. And the frostbite buildup, also very strong. And once again, casting speed, not bad. This is sort of the first spell, aside from Frozen Cragbolt, that is just straight up projectile. And in fact, it's different in flavor. This is actually a break from the flavor of all spells up to this point. This is a spell that is a projectile that's kind of no frills, that just deals damage. So in order for it to make sense within the context of the class, we really needed it to not go too far. If it went too far, then it would be a situation where this is the only spell that you would use, because everything else, it's not worth the time to set up these bursty concepts necessarily, right? Like you may not even need to bother putting down a bunch of mines or bubbles, because you can just spam Cragbolt Spear. And to a certain degree, that's still true, right? If something is relatively close. But really the idea behind the spell is that, like I've mentioned, the power of the class reduces once the fight is actually begun and you have to start reacting instead of setting up your traps as directly. So it needs something that it can do in the middle of fights, weaving in between attacks for punishes, especially on enemies that aren't necessarily constantly trying to close distance. And so in those situations, you do need a spell like this in the toolkit. And Cragbolt Spear is very good. It just is. It just doesn't go that far. Like, if there's anything wrong with the spell, it would be the range. But I think it's working perfectly for what we conceptualized. Okay, Dragonkin Minefield. So this one's gone through a couple of different iterations. On the current iteration, it doesn't do as much damage as it used to in previous patches. It does not air juggle enemies anymore. And you have a much more strict limit on how many mines can be in existence. So there I shut out a bunch of mines, and if I shoot them more mines out over here, all those disappear. Because the limit is the exact number of mines that get spawned when you full charge the spell. So if I don't full charge the spell, I get this many mines. And then if I don't full charge it again, some of those disappear, but not all of them. But now all of these are out. So Once again, this is a limitation that's not just about keeping the spell balanced. It's a limitation that's also about keeping the game from crashing. If we were allowed the player to stack up minefields, then yeah, you're talking about major performance problems. Once again, this is a spell that is just an extension of everything else that's come before it in terms of strategy. This class is very much focused on this style of combat, setting up traps, setting up mines. Each individual mine from minefield does less damage than crack bolt mine. It also staggers less. But because enemies tend to get hit by 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even all of them, it needs to be that way. And just laying down a minefield initially is quite strong, right, in any particular encounter, if you have the ability to do that. Considering that you can also lay down a minefield and then also use regular mines, that you can still create extremely good pre-damage scenarios. Okay, next, Frozen Lightning Storm. So this spell is, once again, we're entering back into that very niche area of spellcasting, right? Where, like, this spell is not going to be good in every situation. It's very specific. Basically, what it's saying is, the enemy you're fighting is huge, and they provide big, giant openings so as to allow you to cast a slow-casted spell. And if both of those things are true, it is amazing. If those things are not true, it's pretty weak, honestly. The amount of damage output it's capable of is incredibly high, and so it needed to be sort of late game. But you can see it's slow. But the amount of damage that each one of those lightning bolts deal is quite high. And I do think that future iterations of the spell will probably have a little bit more going on. I think that they will have perhaps some additional bullets, some residual stuff on the ground, maybe. There's some things I'd like to do to make it more interesting than it currently is, because right now I do find it to be a little bit basic. So I just want to say that up front, that I don't think this spell is 100% finished, just to say. So now we get into Cragbolt Torrent. Once again, it's kind of a break from the traditional strategy that the class is trying to employ throughout the playthroughs. This is basically Comet Azure. It's Crystal Torrent that has been repurposed into a Dragonkin spell. It shoots out just like Comet Azure does, except it doesn't travel in a straight line. It actually sends out a bunch of tendrils in a cone, or a rough cone shape, like this. It's kind of like Comet Azure, but it also builds Frostbite, and it's a little bit less precise. So once again, you don't really want to use this on a small enemy because you're going to be missing at least some of your shots. But if the enemy is sufficiently large, or you're sufficiently close, you once again have a shotgun mechanic going on a sort of Comet Azure style spell. There are some situations, most of them are the same situations that Comet Azure is good, that this spell is amazing. It can be the best spell you have in some situations. You know, that style of spell, we didn't want Comet Azure to be the only game in town, you know, the only one that had this style of long charge up and then hold down to keep channeling concept, you know, for sorcery. So okay, so now we get into the legendary enchantments. These are the strongest permabuffs for the class. The iterations that we're looking at here are for patch 1.3. These are not for previous patch, and that these have been changed for this patch. Namely, the downsides have been decreased of the spell. While active, increases all weapon damage by 10%, reduces weapon stamina consumption by 20%, and increases all absorption by 20%. Reduces total FP by 50%, and reduces all spell damage by 20%. So, it's a melee buff. The idea is you lose some FP, in this case half of it, but that doesn't prevent you from casting, or from using Ashes of War, because it's only taking it down by half, which it was more severe in previous patches. On the current patch that is released right now, it is more severe, but this is for 1.3. And it reduces all spell damage by 20%. So it makes your spells weaker, but not ridiculously weaker. So much more reasonable than it used to be. And then Wisdom of the Makers. This is your caster buff. While active, increases total FP by 20%, adds additional FP regeneration of 2 per second, and increases spell damage by 10%. Reduces total HP by 30%, and decreases all weapon damage by 50%. Once again, this is your caster buff. Now, in terms of, as far as caster buffs go, this is really, really strong, right? The 2 FP per second is a lot. It's extremely powerful. 10% extra spell damage is a lot. and total FP being 20% more is a lot. Like, all three of those things are kind of crazy good. And so the downsides, while not insignificant, in my opinion, might actually be too lenient. If you're a pure caster and you use this, you have no downside. I mean, I suppose, like, the 30% HP reduction is a concession to the fact that these three buffs are really strong. It's like, imagine this. You've reduced your HP by 30%, and then you're spamming Underworld Bubble Shield. You're keeping it up all the time. So the damage, incoming damage you're taking is 75% less. You can't really die even then. It would be really tough. You'd have to really make a big mistake, right? Like, the amount of power that you have with this buff in combination with your other buffs is really, really, really high. It's interesting that neither of these buffs are specific to lightning damage or dragonkin sorceries. It boosts all spell damage and all weapon damage. Yeah, so that is something that may change in the future. They, like, overall, the legendary enchantments might become more specific to help incentivize more dedicated class-driven playthroughs. Definitely, the original thinking when we made a lot of these was more like, well, there's these big downsides, so why not give them big upsides? And that's, like, literally where the thought process stopped. But after testing in alpha, has revealed some things, which is that people love multi-classing. They love, like, if you have intelligence because you're glint, you could just throw on, wisdom of the makers because you have int, right? It doesn't hurt anything, and it's a buff, so it doesn't even matter what kind of staff you're using. So yes, this sort of thing could definitely change. It could even change as early as patch 1.3. So just keep that in mind. Both of these are very, very strong buffs, clearly. Let's show them off. Strength of the Underworld. So one thing I like about the visual of this buff, it conveys everything the class is trying to do, but it's not too visually loud. It's like, it's there, but it's not insane. I think that one thing that might actually help the visual of this particular buff is if it's centered more on the chest of the player rather than, like, on the head and neck where it currently appears to be centered. Like, if it was a little lower on the body, I think it would be even less obtrusive. Then it would kind of be, like, ideal in my mind. So once again, the visuals of the class are not complete, really. They're not really where I want them to be in a final state. But yeah, so you can see it lowered my FP. And it also lowers the damage of your spells, but it makes your weapons hit for a pretty big wallop. Okay, so then we can turn that off. And then we'll do Wisdom of the Makers. So I lost some HP. Visually, once again, it's not too bad. Both of them, though, are a little bit noisy in terms of, like, actual noise, though, I think. So my melee damage is significantly weaker. But if I'm shooting things with spears, big damage. And also really high FP, and, like, the cost is reduced. It's just so good. I mean, it's just so good with that FP regen. I really, in this new iteration where the downsides are much less, I really love these two buffs. I think that they're super, super good. Okay, so that's all the spells for Dragonkin. Let's talk about weapons. The two weapons that come to mind as being the most obvious are these two. The Underworld Dagger is basically just... It's just a dagger. It doesn't have anything special going on with it, except for it boosts Dragonkin sorceries. It has Quick Step, but it boosts Dragonkin sorceries by 10%. Increases their damage. So just simply holding it in a visible place when you're casting will increase the damage of these spells, making it extremely good. The other one is the Underworld Great Mace, which is one of our new weapons. I think a lot of people, a lot of streamers have really enjoyed this weapon. I know I find it to be really fun. But the spell, or the weapon uses a Great Mace moveset, kind of traditional, with normal animations. The most interesting part is the weapon art, or the weapon skill, just Crag Bolt Slam. So, a forward flip similar to Lion's Claw, but it shoots out frozen lightning stake bullets in front of you. It's really good. kind of classic, but also like kind of basic, right? It's accomplishing the goal of getting the whole frozen lightning concept into a weapon very directly. And it's fun. It's fun to use. Nice AoE, nice damage. Very good weapon. Plus, this is one of the few, but there are a few, that builds Frost and Bleed on the same weapon. This is really, really good. Frost and Bleed. That makes it very good. One reason why I didn't feel like it was a problem to make a weapon that builds Frost and Bleed on the same weapon is because this is a Great Mace. Great Maces are slow. It's often kind of hard to get these procs to happen, to hit them often enough in a short enough period of time to actually generate these procs. Very, very strong weapon, I'd say, though. And then let's see. In terms of other weapons, the notable weapons for this class are the Underworld Dagger, the Underworld Great Mace, the Dragonkin Seeker Sword, which is the straight sword you start with the class, which is a repurposed sword that used to be a glint sword, basically. The Dragon Scale Blade, which is a katana, and we're currently reworking the weapon art on that. Clayman's Harpoon, which I really like. I think it's quite strong. Scaling-wise, it's very good. Oh yeah, the Dragonkin Halberd is basically the Dragon Halberd from Vanilla. And so it has a Frozen Lightning Spinning Slash, right, which is also very good. So, like, a decent little suite of weapons. Not too many yet, right? We are, of course, going to be expanding all the weapons of all the different classes eventually. Right now, there is only 2 new armor sets for this class. One of them is a Tier 1, which you start with, and the other one is the one I'm currently wearing, which is the Tier 2. There are not the sort of target number of armors for Tier 2 for the class in the game yet. The plan, of course, is to have at least 3 armor sets for Tier 2 for every class. 1 for caster, 1 for hybrid, and 1 for more melee focus. Right now, there's only this one, because as part of the lore, the 3rd generation, or the early generation Albinarics are part of the Underworld Coalition, basically, the group that is behind the lore of this class. This is the hybrid, right? So basically, instead of just making the 1 caster or the 1 melee, we made the one that's in the middle. So basically, anyone who's Dragonkin could potentially use this and benefit to some degree. So increases your int, reduces your cost of sorcery, and increases all lightning damage by a certain amount, by 5% total on the gear. So like, this is good. You know, I guess if you're pure melee, it's not as good because you're only getting, you're getting reduced sorcery costs, which you may not even care about if you're pure melee. But like I say, we're going to be adding at least 2 more armor sets at some point for this class. Yeah, I'd say overall, like, my conclusions about Dragonkin is that more tactically oriented, trying to lure people into traps. Like, you're not just like playing reactively, you're trying to play like a preparation style of play, right? Almost like a set play style of play. And some people don't love that. They don't want to play in this style. And so not every class, not every play style is for everyone, but that's the benefit of having a lot of classes and trying to explore a different mode of play with each one, right? Is that you could find the thing that you really connect with and you're like, this is me. I really enjoy this way of playing. Yeah, that's Dragonkin Mage. Or Underworld Mage. Shall we do a playthrough?